Welcome to Risking Enchantment, a podcast about art, beauty, and the Catholic faith. Hosted by Rachel Sherlock. Hello, and welcome to the first ever episode of Risking Enchantment. This is a podcast about the Catholic faith, beauty, art, literature, poetry, music, and pretty much anything that takes our fancy. I'm your host, Rachel Sherlock, and before we get into introductions, I thought I would give a little bit of information about the mission of this podcast and what we hope to achieve and what it's all about. So, as I said before, we want to talk about art and culture in all of its various forms, whether or not it's religious or kind of secular or a mixture of the two, and look at how that draws us closer to God. I think there's a general sense in our modern world that there's a kind of crisis of truth and faith and beauty within the world in general and within our church. And when I was setting up this podcast, I was particularly inspired by a quote from Georges Bernanos, who's most famous for writing The Diary of a Country Priest. And he said, "What the church needs is not critics, but artists. When poetry is in full crisis, the important thing is not pointing the finger at bad poets, but oneself to write beautiful poems, thus unstopping the sacred springs." Now, obviously, that seems like a little bit of a contradiction because sitting around on a podcast and talking about art and culture is, in fact, being a critic. But the hope of the podcast is to inspire people to seek out the transcendent and the beautiful and to have it transform their lives and have it draw them closer to God. And that's where the name for the podcast came from, Risking Enchantment. It's from a T.S. Eliot poem called East Coker. And in this context, it really struck me as a challenge to step out of the mundane and the rationally explainable and the scientism that grips our world at the moment, and to step into the elevated and the transcendent. This experience can often be as unsettling as it is awe-inspiring, as any encounter with the truth calls us to convert our lives to God. And so, while the enchantment that we're seeking is a beautiful thing, it's also a risk, because the hope is that we will step into God's will for our lives. So each week I'll be talking with a friend about an aspect of arts and culture and the Catholic faith. But for this first episode, I have both of the wonderful friends who have kindly helped and accepted to take on this podcast with me. So I will have them introduce themselves now. To my left, we've got Phoebe Watson.
I'm Rachel's flatmate, and yes, we are 221B.
Yeah, we are Sherlock and Watson, and nobody believes us. And it's great, but we haven't really solved any mysteries, least of all the mystery of how to work the podcast software. So
we'll have to work on that.
Yeah, we'll definitely figure that out. And then on my right is Maria Connolly.
Hello, I wish I had a more interesting surname, that's all I can say. Having the two detectives here with me today must leave me the criminal. I hope not, anyway.
Or worse, or Mrs. Hudson.
Yeah. So,
or author.
Yeah, or possibly, yeah, exactly. But I am an American living in Dublin, and that's how I got to know these two wonderful young ladies, and I'm just very excited about this podcast as well, because I think it's really important that, especially here in Ireland, we established a community of people that can think and talk about things that really matter to us. So,
brilliant. I think, I should probably introduce myself a little bit. So, as I said at the top, I'm Rachel Sherlock. I am from Ireland. I'm living in Dublin. And I have a background in English and music, and I did a master's in Viking and Anglo-Saxon studies, which means that I did, in fact, write my dissertation on dragons.
We're all jealous.
Yeah. And I, as you might expect from someone who loves Norse things and Anglo-Saxon myths, I'm a huge fan of Tolkien. That's pretty much the first thing everyone knows about me. And I also love music, and I love reading and literature, and that's pretty much where my passion is.
Whereas I have a far less interesting background as a civil engineer, working here in Dublin as well. Rachel and I studied together in Cork, which is my home city in Ireland. And I also love reading greatly. I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan.
Yep.
And I, Maria, speaking again here, also an English aficionado. So I did literature in college, and through that met my husband, who also did English literature and Old Norse and Norse mythology in college. So we have a lot of books in our house, and also one 17-month-old daughter, who is quite the handful.
And enjoys taking all the books down.
She does. She also enjoys her own books, but I think she prefers mom and dad. So I'm a stay-at-home mom at the moment, and loving it. The chance to be able to spend time with her and read to her lots and lots of books.
That sounds almost terrifying, Maria.
It is if she's 17 months old.
Amazing. So I think for the first episode, I think for the episodes going forward, the plan is to take a particular either theme or work or aspect that we're going to look into and just discuss it. But as this is the first episode, I think it makes most sense to try and introduce ourselves a little bit further than we've already done. So I've set everyone 3 questions, and I have them written down here along with my answers, which I now realise means that they can look at my answers.
And we're not going to copy.
Yeah, promise. Definitely. It'll be such a surprise. But yes, so the first question is, name 3 books that most represent your personality or your character. So they don't have to be your favourite, but they do have to give people an insight into who you are. So will I go first?
Go for it.
Okay.
Go for it.
So as I mentioned before, pretty obvious. Number 1, Lord of the Rings.
Well done.
Okay, maybe we are going to copy.
It's not a secret. I fell in love with Lord of the Rings when I was about, I think around 11. It was after the movies came out. I know, shock horror. I watched the movies first, but it's kind of hard for me to understate how much it influenced my life. It drove me to a love of languages and a love of myth and a love of history and English, and it really, I think it speaks a lot to who I am, the level of detail, the kind of intensity of the history and the linguistics. I am the person in the friend group who will always come out with the not so maybe interesting etymology of every word that everyone's talking about. So that's me. I think for my second book, it's probably is also maybe a bit of a cliche. I'm going to go for The Habit of Being, which is the collection of Flannery O'Connor's letters. I love Flannery O'Connor. I love her fiction. I really do love it. But her letters really speak to me, and I really love how she can be incredibly spiritual and incredibly thoughtful while also making jokes and being hilariously funny and sarcastic and withering. And I think she just captures a real sense of myself when I feel like the only way to be close to Christ is being sort of sublime and holy and floating off the ground. So that's another one that really speaks to me. And then finally, I hope this one will be a little bit of a curveball, which I'm going to say is the Brambly Hedge series, which is a series of children's picture books. So whereas Lord of the Rings kind of spoke to my intellectual interests, and The Habit of Being speaks a lot to like my personality, I think the Brambly Hedge books are really representative of how I live my home life and how I want to live my home life, which is the Brambly Hedge books are about a series of mice who live in a hedge, and it's all very sweet and very cute, and they have all kinds of adventures in which they get stuck in the snow, or they throw a ball, and it's all a bit of a muddle, but it's beautiful, and the illustrations are so homely and so cozy, and it's about to me, it's about a simple life lived well. And so, yeah, Brambly Hedge is number 3.
It ties beautifully into what our friends accuse you of, which is living in a fairy tale.
Yeah, I do constantly get accused of that.
It's the best way to live, Rachel. We all know it.
Yeah, pretty much.
I'm really pleased that's on your list, because I gave that to you for Christmas one year.
Yep, you did
Was
pretty
that your
well.
introduction to it, Rachel?
No.
We gave it to you.
No, I used to read the books, and there's actually a stop motion animation which I would highly recommend, particularly the winter one for anyone who wants a Christmas viewing. But yeah, no, I had them growing up. So Phoebe, do you want to go
I'm
next?
going to rustle my paper out. So, when Rachel told me this question, I laughed. And she said that the first one on my list had to be Anne of Green Gables.
It's just a given.
She is Anne,
Yeah.
basically.
Exactly. But I just love Anne as a character. I think she's one of my all-time favourites because she's just this girl who keeps trying to do well and making mistakes. And going off into dreams of her own, and it's just really happy and cute. And Anne isn't perfect; she makes a lot of mistakes.
Yes, she does.
But she keeps trying, and yeah.
I listened to
Love
it for the first time on audiobook only about a month ago, and I think Phoebe got really annoyed because the reader was very good but quite slow, so it was 9 hours long, which
Wow.
for a children's book was probably quite a slog. But I used to get, so I would be listening to something and then I would turn around to Phoebe and say, "No, this isn't, you can't do this to me. This is ridiculous. She can't make this mistake."
And then she'd ask me about something, and I go, "That doesn't happen until book 3. Sorry."
Yeah.
And then the next one on my list is C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet, because part of it really ties into my love of science and physics, but also nature. It's about a guy who gets kidnapped onto this space mission, but C.S. Lewis, being the non-scientist that he is, makes the spaceship round because it's before the time of spaceships, and he hypothesizes that the gravity works by round shapes rather than the weight of something, which is absolutely beautiful. And they go off to Mars, which is like the slightly older planet, and it explores the idea of what an unfallen race would look like. So they're these unfallen, 3 different races under the guardianship of an angel. And their world is just so beautiful. It's like reading pure poetry in descriptions of mountains and nature that's not quite our nature, but all the more beautiful because it's different. And then the last one on my list is a book called The World's First Love by Archbishop Fulton Sheen. And that's an absolute favourite of mine, but it's also the book which introduced me to the love of Mary as my mother and really softened my heart towards her when I was coming into the Catholic Church. And again, it's so beautifully written and just unveiled a whole world of beauty for me, which I'd been shutting myself off to.
See, that's so beautiful. I picked a children's book, but that's amazing.
It needs all sorts, Rachel.
I mean, I put the children's books first.
Yeah,
so.
that's fair. That's okay. I feel better now.
I'm sure Mary has nothing against mice. So that brings us to my 3 books. I found this really hard because if you asked me what my 3 favourite books are, I would tell you hands down The Lord of the Rings 1, 2, and 3. Which would be copying Rachel and also not completely accurate because, as we all know, Tolkien wrote them as one book. But I'm not even going to include Lord of the Rings on my list, even though it is a book that has shaped me. And it's the book that I most enjoy and that most moves me. Because I want to include the Chronicles of Narnia. I know it's not one book either, but bear with me.
Chronicles work.
Chronicles of Narnia. And I say that because I think it really shows a side of me that's always been yearning to have something more, to have something magical in the mundane. And I say that because I remember after I first read the Chronicles of Narnia, myself because my mom had read them out loud to us when I was very small. But after I first read them myself, I was about 8 or 9. And I remember walking up and down the street where I grew up in Texas, touching as many trees as I could because I was convinced that I could find a way to enter Narnia. And I didn't have any wardrobes in my house. I don't know many Americans who do, but we call them closets there anyway. But I wanted to be in a world where bravery and heroism and beauty surrounded me, and where even children could do great things. And so I think the Narnia books really, I guess, illustrate the yearning that I've always had to make everyday things magical. I think Lewis does that amazingly in those stories because, as we know, they're an allegory for our faith, but done in a way in which there's a whole new world to help us to re-see the things that we know, the spiritual realities that we live, but done in a fairy tale format. And I guess it's a really good reminder and a really good, it's motivating for me to think that in the midst of our day-to-day grind, being a stay-at-home mom, there can still be magic and dragons and a talking lion, and maybe those things don't have the same names. Maybe those things have, the names of God or spiritual warfare or whatever the struggles that we have. But it's that yearning for more, for the magical, that I think really speaks to me. My second book is it's actually not a book either. Now there's my third. Oh my goodness! But
you really stuck to the reading.
I know. I never really followed rules that well, as you can tell. But my second book is the Oscar Wilde's fairy tales. I was torn between that one and Northanger Abbey because I have always identified with Catherine Morland, who lived in a world full of fancy and had a very overactive imagination, which I've always identified with because I think sometimes my imagination can get a bit out of control. But the way, or the reason that I chose Oscar Wilde in the end is because of the sheer voluptuousness of his imagery and the beauty of his words. And he himself was an aesthete. Aesthete, I can never say that word right. My husband always makes fun of me. But anyway, he himself believed in beauty, and he had a complicated life and struggled all throughout his life with the idea of beauty, and was particularly attracted to Catholicism, although he had a hit and miss relationship with it. Because of the beauty that he found in the liturgy and in the rites and in the symbols that the church uses. So I think his fairy tales for me show that side of me. Symbols mean a lot to me. They mean the world to me. And all of Oscar Wilde's fairy tales are both beautiful in and of themselves, and they're also beautiful symbols. He's also an Irish writer, so...
That helps.
Yeah, and saying that we're here in Ireland with this podcast, I figured we should at least include one. And then the last work that I wanted to talk about was a poem from one of my favorite poets, John Keats. And I think it's just called Sonnet, but it starts off by saying, "When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has picked my teeming brain," something along those lines. It's a short sonnet, and it's about Keats's mortality. And I think Keats died at 24 or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And his critics say that if he had lived longer, he would have been one of the greatest poets. He already was, but they say he could have become the greatest poet in the English language. But that poem for me has always spoken to me because ever since I was small, I've had a very strange relationship with the idea of death. And death has always kind of fascinated me and obsessed me, and when I was small, terrified me. So the idea of more like the fact that we are mortal and that our lives are only so long and that we are ceaselessly moving along them, I guess it just gives the meaning and the urgency to anything I do, because we only have one life and we only have one chance to love God and to love others. So that poem has always spoken to me in that way, of, tempus fugit, we have to get our act together and kept moving. You know, there's an urgency to everything we do. And I think that's something that's very Catholic as well, and very Irish, you know, the understanding of death, and death is not something to ignore. It's something to be aware of so that we can be living for the next life, you know, and not just for this life. So those are my 3 works.
That was amazing.
And I'm just going to interrupt here and say that we're going to try to link everything in the show notes so that you don't have to go searching
Googling
back through
random
them.
sonnets.
Yes, yeah, I'll try and provide links for everything.
If we can work the software.
I think we can do it.
We can figure it out.
Well, I was going to come in and say, when you were talking about the Chronicles of Narnia, I think that's so funny because I have a very, very lame story of what I used to be like when I was a kid, which was I would genuinely walk around my garden and say, an adventure is going to happen now.
That's the thing, like, we all have this longing, don't we, for something extraordinary to happen to us.
I was convinced that at any moment one of all of the fairy tales that I had ever read was about to happen.
Start, and
I just had to be aware enough, or I just had to look in the right place. I'd see something moving in the trees, or I'd see, you know, like something would happen. And I used to genuinely do the whole, like, it's going to happen now. Now. And yeah, I definitely got the same experience from the Chronicles of Narnia. I've told this story a million times. I live, my parents' home is a detached home, so it's not actually next to any other homes, but we did have a crawl space in the attic. So we didn't have a lot of big wardrobes, but we did have a crawl space in the attic, which is very like the one described in The Magician's Nephew. So I was always convinced, even though that's not even the magical bit of that story, like they still have to get into the study and then go to the next world, but I was always convinced I'd find another house attached to my completely detached house.
And in that house, an adventure would happen now.
Exactly.
Whereas we technically had a crawl space, but it was horrible, so I never went in there.
Okay.
Where's your spirit of adventure, Phoebe?
Well, when it's stuff full of like that polystyrene
Oh, yeah.
insulation that you really don't want to breathe in, no.
Maybe better not.
Yeah. I had too much common sense, unfortunately.
Oh, well, there we go. And we just said you were an Anne. But I think actually the point you brought up there is really important. I think it's something the 3 of us share, and I think a lot of people share, which is that particularly as children, you did yearn for a world that was bigger than yourself and more romantic and more true. I think the word is true. That
Right.
like there is a truth to it that is not actually our experience of the real world, even as children. That everything's a lot more boring and mundane, and that's not to say I had a great time when I was a kid, and I had a great time playing imaginary games as a kid. But quite a lot.
But there's a bigger adventure that we're yearning for.
Yeah.
And I mean, our faith gives us that. Like, our life is that, right?
Yeah.
That we're going on an adventure towards God.
And I sometimes I wonder, because I hear the language of a lot of the saints and a lot of the mystics have written about being swept up in the love affair that is your relationship with Christ. And as someone who still obviously struggles with prayer, as most people do, I can find that hard to relate to, but I can understand it more when I think of it as being swept up in an adventure of someone bringing me into a whole world of nobility and virtue and sacrifice and pain that all has meaning and all has a bigger worth than just my individual like rises and falls of my various days. That's
really good.
Well done for nailing that one on the head, Maria. So our second question was, because as you can tell from our introductions, we're all kind of literature geeks. Like, we love books and we love poetry and things like that. But that's not the only thing I want to talk about, and it's not the only thing that I think contributes to this sense of transcendence and wonder and things like that. So I wanted to draw in one of my personal favourites, which is architecture. So our second question is, an experience in a church that drew you closer to God, specifically through either the atmosphere or the architecture of the church. And since we're taking turns, I guess it's my turn again. And hilariously, I set these questions and then realised that I had to come up with answers for them.
Serves you right.
So I set the question, and then I was like, oh, what am I even going to say for this? And then I remembered a particularly profound experience I had 2 years ago on Christmas Day, which is the perfect day for wonder. My granny comes to visit us for Christmas, but she's quite elderly. 2 years ago, she would have been 91 at the time, so she's 93 now. But she's not able to sit through a mass. She's not really up to that anymore. But we still want her to come to a church, and she still wants to come to a church on Christmas Day. So sometime in the afternoon on Christmas Day, we bundled her up in the car and brought her to a church, not super near us, but a particularly beautiful church that's set in a very steep, deep valley and very narrow. And is a very, very small church. I keep trying to count how many seats are in it just because it blows my mind at how small it is. But it's very, very small. Its main altar is actually the side altar from another church. It got donated, so it's a very little petite church, and it's very beautiful, but it's also quite actually American because it's got a lot of like wooden exposed beams, and it's got that kind of sense to it, and it feels very enclosed. Like it feels like there's foliage right outside the windows just from the angle of the valley, and it feels very, very enclosed. And that particular Christmas Day was a dark, rainy, dreary Christmas Day, and we all bundled into this church that had no lights on. I think there might have been one or two at the bases of the two statues. And it was very dark and very rainy and very... It's funny because it was Christmas Day and it was quite an Advent feel because there was this sense of expectation. It was this sense that we were sitting in the dark and something amazing was about to happen. And my dad asked me to sing In the Bleak Midwinter for me and my family. And so we just sat there in this very gloomy, very dark, but beautiful, and it was the darkness just before the sunrise. That's what it felt like. It just felt like it was still, and it was expectant, and it was in that way wonderful. Like it was full of wonder, and it's always really, really struck me. I just love that memory of being with my family and sitting around in an empty, dark church on Christmas Day. And it's funny because even later, the first one that popped into my mind, but I think I didn't name it as my first one, was because it was actually informed by that experience at Christmas, which was that I was in Rome almost this time last year for the first time, and we went to Santa Maria Sopra Minerva, which is just beside the Pantheon, and again it was just about to close. All the lights were off, and if anyone has been to that church, you know that there's a lot of incredibly beautiful churches in Rome, but this is a Gothic church, which is a little bit unusual for Rome, and so it has these high ceilings and these like dark walls, and again, it was sitting there in the dark with that sense of wonder that something incredible was going to happen, that adventure was going to happen now. And yeah, that was an experience that I had where just the actual space of the church. And I think it's really funny because we were just having a discussion with our friend Ed, who has a pet peeve where he says that all Irish churches are too well lit, because they should be darker and they should have that sense of not gloominess, but that it's not a shopping mall. It doesn't need to be fluorescent lit all over, and yeah, that the lighting and the space of a church can really inform an encounter with God.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about light, because the church near where I work, where I go in to say the rosary every now and then, used to have a beautiful stained glass window behind the altar, like a huge one. So with Mary and then the crucifix above her and St. Patrick and St. Bridget on either side holding her cloak, and it forms the shape of the miraculous medal. But it's away for cleaning at the moment. And it's been away for like the last 6-8 months. And the light in the church has changed so dramatically because now you've just got plain glass there, which obviously lets in all the bright sunlight. And you're like, I can't see the beautiful gold mosaic illustrations of the gospel writers beside the window now because of the stained glass is gone. It's
funny, they really did know what they were doing when
they made stained glass. Yeah. And they put it in churches for a reason.
And I was going to talk about that one, but I'm actually going to talk about a stained glass that's not in a church. It's in the National Art Gallery, and it's a Harry Clarke stained glass, and it's of the crucifix, but it's Mary holding Christ as he's just come down from the crucifix. So you've got the cross behind Mary, and then Mary, and then Christ laid out in her arms, and all the shapes are kind of slightly elongated. And then you've got saints surrounding her. You've got Saint Francis with birds, and I think Saint Scholastica. But I just stopped for a good 10 minutes at that beauty, and for me that was a real encounter with stillness and a real encounter with the onus to slow down. And all these people, because it was in a very small room with like a door either side, so people just walking straight through. So I was on one side of the room facing the painting, and all these people walking through me, between me and the paint and the stained glass every now and then. And it was just a contrast between the busyness of the world, even in a gallery, where you just go glance, 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 and that stillness that God calls us to encounter him in.
That's really good.
That's amazing. I don't suppose I presume it was meant to be in a church.
Yeah.
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 I think it was from maybe Edinburgh or one of the churches that had been in renovation, and then. Yeah. But to be fair, I think you can sometimes see a stained glass window like that much better than you could when it's because sometimes the stained glass isn't. You can't see it. Yeah, it's not put on display. The light behind it isn't right.
Yeah.
It's too high up. You can't see it quite properly. Yeah. So I wasn't insulted that it wasn't in a church, but it was meant to be in a church. It was constructed for that in the beginning.
Yeah.
Right. That's interesting though. There's so much talk of stained glass. I think it is my favourite art form. And I have two architectural things, just to keep breaking the rules, that you so kindly set up for us, Rachel.
I put down. I talked about two, so I think we'll survive.
I think actually. But mine are actually a sharp contrast, because the first was also in Rome. I mean, it's all of St. Peter's, really. Like, when you first walk into the arms, I guess they're called, the pillars that are surrounding St. Peter's Basilica, that I remember I first walked into that plaza when I was 16 years old, and I am a cradle Catholic. I was brought up Catholic, but never in my life had I felt such a sense of coming home or belonging as I did when I walked into that plaza, into that square. I literally felt like I was being embraced.
It's almost the story of the prodigal son, isn't it?
It is. It's so strong, and it's an architectural feat. It's amazing that could evoke such feeling in somebody's soul just by stone and, design. Like, it's amazing. And then in the actual basilica, I remember we went to a mass that was in one of the side chapels there, and it was a sunny day, and I don't know which of our listeners have been to Rome or seen the basilica there, but behind the Baldacchino there is a giant stained glass Holy Spirit. I'm not even sure who the artist is. I'm sure we can find that out for the show notes. Right, Rachel? So it's a giant stained glass of a dove, meant to symbolize the Holy Spirit. And there are red and orange and yellow rays coming out of the dove. And I had never really thought much about the Holy Spirit before then. I had just made my confirmation. But even with that, it was a very academic thing for me. But I remember going up to and coming back from receiving communion in that small side chapel mass. I remember feeling like I was bathed in light because of the way the sun was coming through that stained glass window and falling on me. And it was almost like, it was a very, very strong experience, because it wasn't just the physical light, but I actually felt the light of grace in that moment, kind of mirroring the light from outside. And it was very like sensitive, like it was very feeling type experience. I know that's not necessary or important for prayer or for our relationship with God, but it's a moment I'll never forget, because that for me has always been what stayed in my head as what the Holy Spirit is. The light in the darkness, the light in the shadows of my heart. When I'm least expecting it, the sudden shaft that comes through and illuminates the things that maybe I didn't see very clearly. So for me, stained glass has always been one of the most, I guess, spiritual forms of architecture. And then the other is actually on the same trip, so I highly recommend going to Rome if you get the chance, but was the catacombs. And that's not something that any architect would, boast about having constructed, because I don't think it was any architect who was digging out the tombs for the first Christian martyrs. But I remember the feeling of awe and just overpowering wonder and respect for the people that had given their lives rather than deny Christ. And as you walk through the catacombs, the walls are right up close to you, and you can almost sometimes only go single file. They're underground burial vaults, for those who don't know, all throughout the city of Rome, where the first Christians both buried their dead that died in the Colosseum during the gladiatorial fights that were killed by the emperors, and also where they celebrated Mass. So there's small chambers in the catacombs, kind of like passageways that open up into these kind of little rooms where the first Christians would have huddled in the darkness to share Christ's body and blood. And that was an incredibly powerful thing for me as well, just because of the idea of the saints. And again, that sense that it's not worth, life is not worth giving up your faith, like our life is short, and these people would have been dead thousands of years anyway now at this stage, even if they had denied their faith, but they chose the greater part. And we're walking through their tombs now because they did. And it's just like, it was a strong reminder of the communion of saints that doesn't go away with the passing of time, and that death doesn't win. That now they're saints and martyrs and triumphant, even if they are in these tiny little tomb spaces,
Yeah, I think
the
Rome
remains
is a real encounter with the communion of saints.
It is,
Because even like the arms that you were talking about, I love the way they're all statued with different saints, and then in St. John Lateran's with all the 12 apostles, and they're gigantic.
I loved that experience of standing at the feet of the apostles.
It's like being in Gondor or something.
Yeah,
seeing the kings of old.
It does feel like the Argonauts. Like, nothing prepared me, and no photo really captures how big they feel when you walk into St. John Lateran. They just feel enormous. And it was the same in St. Peter's with the statues. Like, I loved the one of Veronica, that sense of movement in stone, which I'm kind of always blown away by. But if we have enough time, I'll just say one more, which you reminded me in Rome, which was just such an incredible experience. We went to the Basilica of St. Cecilia, and it was a particularly poignant moment for us because we were travelling with my friends, and I were travelling, and one of us was joining the Dominican Sisters of Saint Cecilia. So this was this was our last big holiday as a group, and so she really wanted to visit it, obviously, and it was a really, really beautiful church. And as we were kind of mooching around, we went to the gift shop, and they were like, "Oh, would you like to see the foundations?" And I think the catacombs. I could be wrong.
There are catacombs of Saint Cecilia.
Yeah, but it's a little bit confusing because they're right beside the foundations of her home. Yeah. So I'm not. Maybe I'm a little bit confused about the details. But they were like, "Oh, would you like to visit the catacombs?" And we were like, "Oh, of course. This is one of." We were a little tight on budget, but this was one of our big visits for the holiday, so we wanted to make sure that we saw as much of it as possible. So we said, of course, and we all trooped downstairs, and it was very nice. If anyone's been to any sort of Roman foundations, there's a lot of, oh, look at these stones on the ground that were there 2,000 years ago. And it is really impressive, and it is really cool, and you do get a sense that like people actually walked on this, or like, here's a bit of pottery, or here's a grave of someone, but it feels like a very academically archaeological experience, and so we were just wandering around and having fun and goofing around a little bit. Scandalous, I have to say. And we were going down a very long, narrow corridor, which almost felt like something from like a video game. And we turned, and right beside us was this incredible chapel that was so decadent in its mosaics, and there was a statue of Saint Cecilia, and like you said, with the saints, there was like
the one with her decapitated on the floor.
No, that's actually up in the church.
Okay.
But it's it's
statue.
Yeah. It's a statue of her standing there, and I think there's Saint Agnes and a couple of the other female martyrs. There's mosaics of them, but it was so decadent and so lush, and nobody advertised it anywhere. Nobody was like, "Oh, check out this amazing chapel." We definitely know that there was other people who visited the catacombs that looked around the first room or two and then went back up and didn't see it, because it was such a surprise. But it was a real kind of encounter with like the real world or like the mundane, and then expanding into the transcendent. I suppose we better get on to our last question, or second to last, because I think at the end of each episode we're going to do a roundup question, but we'll get to that in a minute. I want to ask an experience with secular, or at least not explicitly religious, culture that brought you closer to God. I've just been talking loads, but I think it's my turn again. No. Okay. And when I was trying to come up with an answer, the first thing that kind of struck me was that I actually, maybe for good or for ill, I don't necessarily separate a lot of the literature that I read with explicitly religious, like, theology or to me, reading Lord of the Rings obviously teaches me about God, or reading Brideshead Revisited, it's a really Catholic book, so it obviously teaches me about God. So I find it hard to feel like those are secular works. But instead, I'm going to go for something a little bit different, which is music. And I don't necessarily have a specific one-time example, but I think for me, music, I don't listen to a lot of Christian music, and that's not because I don't like it. I've been to Christian music concerts. I could identify lots of music that I do like, but on my day-to-day, that's not the music I tend to listen to. But the music I do tend to listen to, I think music, because it's always like exploring the questions of the soul, like any piece of art is, but there's few pieces of art that are so digestible as like a 3.5 minute song. And so it's often that it's a really powerful glimpse into a real search for the soul. And a lot of the music that I listen to is grappling with themes of religion. So you've got something like Mercy Street by Peter Gabriel, or one that I've been really struck with recently, which is called All Colours of the Night by an artist called Peter Broderick, which I'm not going to quote lyrics because it's much more of a like instrumental experience, but it does talk about encountering God actually in a dark room, which is exactly what I've been talking about. But it always kind of takes my breath away that I can really encounter someone's search for God. And even when it's not explicitly religious, I think because music often deals with emotions at their most aching, that any emotion like that is an emotion that correlates to our aching for God. So there's one in particular that I want to mention, which is Winter by Tori Amos. Tori Amos deals with a lot of religious themes in her music, and some people would find it, some people don't like that, and some people do. I really like it, but Winter isn't actually about that. It's about, well, it's not explicitly about it, because it is about the relationship between a father and a daughter, and it's one of the most heartbreaking representations of how that relationship feels from both sides. And I listened to it. My dad was the one who introduced me to Tori Amos, and we listened to that song. And he used to drive me home from school, so I remember dark nights where I would be sitting in the car with him and we would play that song, and it was always such a powerful experience to have someone express that feeling. And of course, because it's between a father and a daughter, then you have that feeling of like our ultimate Father in heaven, and the ultimate yearning, and the yearning to be understood by him, and the need not to be left on your own. So yeah, that's my example, which is Winter by Tori Amos.
I'm going to be listening to that on the way home today.
So the example I came up with is kind of related because it's a musical, and I chose Phantom of the Opera.
Okay.
Which is a movie and a musical, and it's a soundtrack that I listened to a lot in my final year of college. But I think one of the things that really draws me about it is the contrast between darkness and light. And you've got this character called Christine Daae, who's really grappling between the call of the dark side of the art of music and the lightness of it. And then contrasting that to, for me, it would be more related to books, but there is sometimes a darkness in the literature that we read, as well as a light, and it relates to me that way. But one of my favourite songs from that is a song called Past the Point of No Return. And for me, at that time, I was just preparing to come into the Catholic Church, and that was really going past the point of no return.
Wow, yeah.
In a good way, I hope.
In a good way. But that always...
It's not Dante's Inferno, abandon all hope.
No, it is about abandonment, but more an abandonment.
It feels that way.
It's about more about an abandonment of self to a higher...
Of course,
something higher. And that's always really related to me in my relationship to God, that he's calling us to trust him beyond what we can see.
Yeah.
That's really good. I actually thought of the Phantom of the Opera as well, but a different song. I've been thinking of, I think it's All I Ask of You, because I always thought of that as like a song about the relationship between a soul and God. But that's another story, because that wasn't the one I was going to talk about today. What I was going to talk about today is a book that I actually hate with all my guts.
This
but
is excellent.
That I need to talk about because it has shaped the way I think of God and I see the world. It's a book by Virginia Woolf called Mrs. Dalloway. And it's a book that I was...
Sorry, Phoebe and I are giggling because Phoebe knows that I don't have a lot of time for Virginia.
Neither do I!
If anyone wants to write in and tell me I'm wrong, I'm very happy to read it, but
Well, I think you should read this book, and it's a very interesting short novel. It is rather objectionable at times from a Catholic perspective. But the way Virginia Woolf in that book deals with perspective entirely changed the way I think about truth. Because it's a story of a middle-aged, unhappy woman and her daily routine, basically. And I know there's a lot more to it than that. My English professor right now would be probably having a fit in the background. But the book is told through the eyes of many different characters through their perspectives. And I remember the class in which we discussed this story, the lecturer was going on about how that is how reality is, that reality isn't one thing or another. Reality, no one can have an understanding of reality because reality is different according to the lens or the perspective through which you see it. And my Thomistic background, my Catholic education was having a bit of a heart attack at this, thinking he was saying that there is no such thing as objective truth. And I think that's what he was saying. And I think that's maybe what Virginia Woolf was trying to get at, and a lot of the other modernists, when they wrote about the different perspectives that the world can be seen through. But at the same time, it was as if a light bulb went off in my head. And I had a moment when I thought, of course we can't know all the truth. Of course the truth is not knowable by one perspective. And of course we aren't right all the time. I mean, if we thought that we were, then we'd be dying of spiritual pride and intellectual pride and lots of other types of pride. But the only person, the only being, the only thing that can know everything, that can see every perspective is God. And that's why it's incredibly important to keep an open mind when we speak to people that don't share our opinions or our views. Because I'm not saying, yes, everyone has an equal percentage of the truth, or everyone has an equal allotment of the truth, or everyone can see the truth as clearly as everyone else. But nobody, especially not myself, can see all of the truth. And for me, it was a humbling experience to understand God a little bit more. And saying that even sounds ridiculous to me now, because I can't understand God at all. And I always put God into a box, and I always make God more human, because that's how I am and that's how I think and that's what I constantly do to God. I constantly shrink him to fit me. And reading this book, this troubling book by this troubled woman, helped me to understand God and to understand the way that I should think about the world and the way that I should think about people that aren't like me and that don't agree with me. So I think it's a matter of perspective and a matter of taking myself out of the place of God that I had myself in and that I always consistently edge myself back into. So it was a good reminder for me and a really unsettling book in that sense.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I don't think with this podcast, obviously a lot of it will be talking about things that we appreciate and like and comfort us in a way, but I don't intend to only talk about things that fit into our boxes or things that fit into what the Catholic Church would deem correct.
Right.
Because
it's risking enchantment that we're trying to do here, and
absolutely
riskiness is it's always got to stretch us a bit, right?
Yeah. Okay, that's amazing. I think we're going to round up, and I'm afraid we're going to spring this on you, Maria, because I forgot to send you the message last night. But
as long as I can break the rules, it's all good.
You'll
answer entirely different.
So our last question, and I think we're going to do this for every episode, is going to be what has inspired you in the last week, month? Like, what have you been reading? Has there been anything you've listened to? So,
what piece of art are you encountering at the moment?
Precisely is the words that I need. And since you put it so well, Phoebe, why don't you go first?
Well, considering it was my question, I actually had to come up with the answer.
Yep.
And mine is the book that I'm reading at the moment, which is St. Francis of Assisi by G.K. Chesterton. And it's just beautiful and, as Maria said earlier, whimsical and just lovely in all its ways, but it's written in a very interesting sense in that it's not a straightforward biography of St. Francis as a child, St. Francis setting up reconstructing the church as a building and then trying to reconstruct the church as a whole through his order. It more takes an aspect of St. Francis and looks at it throughout his whole life. And one of my favourite parts of that was he was talking about the troubadours and then the jugglers that went with them, and St. Francis's transition from the troubadour and the singing of the love songs to the more ridiculous juggler and his embracing of that role of humility. But also I love how it gives a real sense of the world at that time, because he argues that to understand St. Francis, you can't take him outside of the context of what the church was before he came and what the church was during his time. Yeah. So it's a really powerful book like that.
I am going to have to read it, considering I think I gave it to you.
You did.
Okay.
We give each other books a lot.
Yeah, I mean,
it is as it should be.
Christmas is coming up. Guess what I'm going to get everyone? Books. Yeah, I think my answer, this is really funny because it's going to sound like I'm so intellectual and so, highbrow. But
You're going to come across as such a snob.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm actually reading Dante's Inferno for the first time.
Do you want to explain why you're reading that?
It's only the first time, Rachel, yeah. So you're not that snobby. Keep going.
You also have at least the incentive of a book club to keep you going.
Well, so my work is quite near the Italian Institute, and so they have a series going on, and unfortunately I missed in the previous years when I did not work near there, and I missed the Inferno and the Purgatorio, but they're doing the Paradiso, so I'm trying to frantically catch up. So I've only just started it, although I do know a lot of background about it. I've heard a lot of people talking about it, so I'm very excited to be reading that, and certainly the start of it has it has that sense that I think it's going to kind of blow my socks off a little bit. But in terms of something I've finished recently, I also, to my shame, had never read the Screw Tape Letters before, and so I got it on audiobook recently and finished it a couple of weeks ago. And suffice it to say that it has impressed me so much that I have kept going back to listen to parts of it. And I really, really love it. I've been recommending it to everyone. I don't want to say it's the best thing I've read by Lewis, because I've read a lot of incredible things by Lewis. It's probably just the most recent thing I've read by him, but it certainly has really blown me away.
It's a beautiful combination of his like whimsical fantasy and his faith.
Yeah, I think that's it, because it is while all, like, certainly as we discussed, Narnia is that too, but it's much more explicit, so it's a real kind of meeting ground of what his imagination can do and what his theology can do.
And it's hilarious as well.
It's very, very funny.
So it's worth a read. Okay, so I have been reading a lot of books that I've very much enjoyed, but I'm not going to talk about those, just to change things up. And I think the main... What was the exact question again?
Phoebe?
I forgot it.
It was some art.
No, and what art has been inspiring you?
So I am going to talk about an idea of something that my husband and I are doing that has been eating up my insides for the last few weeks / months / year, that we're working on together, and it's a way of making our home more enchanted and also more liturgical. So you know, in Narnia, if you've read Narnia, I hope you have, because I don't want to give any spoilers, but the White Witch rules over Narnia for, I think it's 100 years. Yeah. And during that time, the entire forest is covered in snow and full of winter, but Christmas never comes. So my husband and I were trying to figure out how to beat the frantic rush to put up Christmas decorations in October or whatever time they do these days, and how to really live the season of Advent in our home, but at the same time not be the weirdos who didn't decorate at all until the 24th. So we came up with the idea of making our home into an Advent winter until Christmas Eve, and decorating the entire house with white and silver and snow, as if the White Witch were indeed in power in our home until Christmas Eve. And the night of Jesus' birth, after our children, but I should say child at the moment, after a child goes to bed, we are going to change all the decorations out for the exact same decorations, but in green and gold and sparkling scarlet, just so that it really feels like Christmas has come at last and the spell of winter is broken. So I think for the last few months, yes, I've been thinking about this since well before August. I have been working on decorations and ideas of how to do that in practice and how to actually make that transformation happen. Because I think it's incredibly important for people in general, but especially for children, to be able to tangibly see the symbols of our faith, especially in our homes. So that's something that has been kind of taking up all my mental space and energy, and that I'm most excited about. It's not a work of art that is finished yet, but it's something we're working on together. It's something we're very much looking forward to doing. So
it sounds fabulous.
Well, just come over on Christmas Day and you'll see. You have to come over in Advent as well, though, so you can see the change.
Because Maria told me about this yesterday, and I'm so glad that I forgot to tell Phoebe, so that I could see her reaction live right now, which was one of awe and wonder.
My husband put his foot down on actually having an effigy of the White Witch in our home during Advent. He said that might not be quite the idea that we're going for. So we won't be having any witches around.
But I think that's such a wonderful compromise, because I do think there's a real struggle. I definitely see the need for a penitential Advent.
Yeah.
But also Advent for me was such a time of wonder, because as you might have guessed from my descriptions of the churches, I love the wonder of sense of sitting in a dark church and expectation. So
the expectation.
Yeah.
I think keeping Advent has been really difficult for us, because we usually leave here before Christmas and go to our family homes.
Yeah.
So you have to have the decorations up long enough to enjoy them before that.
Yeah.
Which is always a battle between when do we decorate and how do we enjoy Advent.
Yeah. Yeah. So Well,
So we'll let you know if it works anyway, and
Yeah.
What our 17-month-old thinks. If she even notices. She did notice the Christmas tree lights last year, so I'm hoping she notices a bit more this year.
I think she'll give you lots of constructive feedback.
Lots of destructive feedback. Okay.
Considering how much she was enjoying destroying our sort of autumnal decorations here yesterday.
She's good at that. She's good at that.
But that's amazing. Well, thank you so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us again soon. And thank you for taking this adventure with us that's happening right now.
Right,
and we've
this
definitely
very
run
moment.
far over the time from what we expected to do.
Yes.
We knew that was going to happen. Let's face it.
Yeah, that's what this is going to be all about, running over time.
The 40 minutes you said.
Yeah.
Not going to happen.
Anyway, thank you very much, and we hope to have you with us next time. This has been Risking Enchantment. Music by Kevin MacLeod. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @SeekingWatson. And you can find out more about me and the podcast at rachelsherlock.com. Thank you and God bless.